Hello everyone! Tonight we start with the orgy planner, one of the more peculiar occupations in ancient Rome. Indeed, someone needed to plan the wine, keep an eye on the grapes, plan the entertainment, and ensure that nobody unintentionally brought their mother-in-law. Roman feasting culture was not only about pleasure, it was also about power, status, networking, and, well, a good deal of nudity. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. Additionally, tell me in the comments what time it is for you and where you are tuning in from. Seeing who is joining us from around the globe is always exciting. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. Your eyes open before sunrise, not because you're disciplined, because you're anxious. Since you're in charge of organizing tonight's prestigious Roman orgy, your mind has already generated 17 potential problems before breakfast. Someone has already pushed a scroll under your door, your tunic is wrinkled, and your sleeping mat is still warm. The crackle is menacing. With the solemn determination of a soldier reading his draft notice, you unfold it. The wife of your patron would want to remind you that the last time guests noted that the rose petals were yellow instead of crimson. Your barley hasn't even been touched yet. Rome is just waking up outside. However, you're already mentally balancing blazing amphorae. Senators, philosophers, artists, two bitter rival courtesans, and according to rumors, a member of the imperial family are among the guests today. Nobody tells you who, of course. It might be a relative. Caligula, perhaps. In any case, if someone doesn't massage their peacock enough, you'll be held accountable. You put on your sandals and start the day with a clipboard and dread, just like every other Roman orgy planner. What's the first thing to do? Staffing. Yesterday, you dispatched runners to reserve dancers, harpists, flute girls, and a man who balances a tray of figs on his feet and walks on his hands. None have confirmed. In the Siwa right now, you suspect at least 2 people are intoxicated. The food comes next. You have asked for olives, dates, figs, honey-roasted dormice, oysters, and a number of dubious meats from the eastern regions. Everything must arrive fresh, or at least freshish. One bad oyster and half the forum will be whispering that you poisoned Senator Gaius. Not to mention the cushions. The last time, a magistrate wearing a lot of togas caused one of the divans to collapse, and the consequences were political. This time, the couches need to be strong enough to withstand any mishap, and you are well aware of what occurs on them. The sun is barely up, and you're already sweating into your linen. You take a breath. You remind yourself that you are a professional, a mastermind behind turmoil, a maestro of madness. Even if the day will be long, the guests won't realize how close you were to yelling. The pillows will be fluffed, and the wine will be poured. At least not yet. Even though it's early, you're already opening a new scroll with the most recent guest list for today. As you read it slowly, you prepare for the worst. This isn't a seating arrangement, it's a social powder keg with olives on top that is carefully balanced. Of course, Lucius Calpurnius Piso is there. He attends every event and is adamant about lounging in the middle couch, ideally beside someone else's spouse. The issue is that Aurelia, his wife, is also attending. She wasn't invited, but that's never stopped her before. You write something down. Separate couches, separate wine sources, and definitely no harp solos while they're both in the room. Last time she threw a garum jug. Next, Senator Petronius Arbiter has accepted. Known for his tongue, not necessarily in a lyrical sense, he was a dangerous and smart man. You'll need to seat him far from Junius Blasus, whose poetry Petronius once described as a slow death written in meter. Then you see it, Domitianus and 2 unidentified visitors. It is offensive how ambiguous it is, could be esteemed customers. They might be gladiators, might be a toga-clad giraffe. You type West End, flexible seating, and then you're done. Now for the entertainers. 4 flute girls, 3 dancers, and the mime twins. That's already one more performer than Lucullus approves of. Mimes are barbarous to him. However, he finds his mistress's approval crucial to his status, and she finds them pleasant. There is more to the guest list than just a list of names. It's a living map of ancient Roman tension, politics, power, lust, family feuds and vendettas, all reclining together on silk-covered couches, drinking from the same communal bowl of wine. And of course, the real terror, an influential person who was not invited. The hushed accusations are already audible. It was deliberate. A public insult. I'll never lend him my bath slaves again. You roll up the scroll. You create a new one. You sketch arrows. Include cautions. Put names in circles. You're not organizing a gathering. You are in charge of a live, diplomatic simulation that involves roasted dormice and aphrodisiacs. You've done this before, though. You'll repeat it. You just hope that nobody gets stabbed over couch placement this time. Not like last spring. With the guest list finalized, or at least stable enough not to implode, it's time for the next crisis, provisioning. It takes more than just burning torches and pouring wine to plan a Roman orgy. The goal is to create a dinner that is so rich that the gods feel underdressed. Your list is already 3 tablets long. Let's begin with the fundamentals, wine. Not any wine, though. It must be Falernian, aged and expensive enough to make your sponsor wince. You write 3 amphorae Falernian, 2 of curcuban for show, 1 of vinegar to serve to the guests who arrive late. Next, oysters, imported, fresh from Baiae. When they get there, they must be alive, or at least plausibly wet. You inform the seafood vendor that half of the oysters were already dead the last time, and one of the guests saw this as a sign he is still getting better. A mainstay of Roman decadence is honey-roasted dormice. They must be plump, not stringy, when dipped in honey and rolled in poppy seeds. You request 50. You'll receive 35, half will still twitch. You add roasted peacock, stuffed sow's udder, dates from Judea, figs from Carthage, and cheese wrapped in vine leaves. Additionally, you write down a note to avoid any mishaps involving the bread this time. The last event's anchovy-scented rolls nearly caused a riot. Almond cakes, candied nuts, and some kind of visual display, perhaps a cake in the shape of the Colosseum with real songbirds inside, are required for dessert. The logistics of baking will be worked out later. Then comes the perfume budget. Myrrh, rose oil, saffron water, enough incense to make a Vestal virgin dizzy. You make a note, discreetly scent the latrines. You stare at the list. Looks more like a military requisition than a menu, and it costs more than a decent villa outside Ostia. However, this is Rome. Opulence is expected. Gluttony is style. Furthermore, the reputation of your patron rests on the guests being too enthralled with the opulence to notice that the music is out of tune and that someone has spilled wine on the marble lions. With precise instructions, you give the scroll to your fastest runner. No replacements, no apologies, and if he forgets the sugared grapes again, I'm feeding him to the flamingos. It's time to offer prayers to Mercury, the god of delivery and trade. Let's get something straight. A vomitorium isn't what you think it is. To clear out mid-feast and make place for additional peacocks, the Romans did not construct dedicated rooms. It's a later myth, most likely created by someone who couldn't think any another explanation after witnessing Romans eating. At actuality, the vomitorium refers to the entrance and departure corridors at Roman amphitheatres, where masses would swarm out following performances. Despite this, contemporary imaginations continue to conjure images of throw-up lounges with marble tiles, populated by feather fans and perfume lords. Romans did, however, overindulge. Furthermore, nobody questioned guests who discreetly excused themselves to go outside and rehydrate. Therefore, it is your responsibility as an orgy planner to ensure that the entire space, from the triclinium to the atrium to the private garden alcove, is prepared to withstand the effects of excess. You start the inspection in style. The floors of the banquet hall must be immaculate. Mosaic tiles require a quick clean, particularly the area where Bacchus is riding a panther. A grape stem from last week's party becomes lodged in the grout, and you personally pull it out. You are aware of your expectations. Fresh sponges on sticks are placed in the latrines, which are also cleaned and scented. The vinegar with a hint of lemon is revitalizing. Near the threshold, a candle glows softly for dignity rather than light. You check the fountain basins again out in the courtyard. It's common for patrons to lean back too much and fall in after their fifth glass. The general's wife almost drowned in the koi pond the last time. Since then, you have taken the koi out. The wife cannot be taken away. You walk through the scent area, which is set up like an apothecary for indulgence with oils and salves, myrrh, cinnamon, and rose. Your wrist smells like a love letter to Venus after you sample one. Excellent. You then examine the myth room of the vomitorium, that is, a silent corridor with a chair, a bronze basin, a curtain, and a courteous slave standing by with a fan. Of course, it's not called that. The refuge is the name of it. However, everyone is aware of its purpose, and it must also sparkle, clean, fragrant, and opulent. No one leaves this party feeling less than respectful, regardless of how extravagant things get tonight. If they decide to purge, they will do it in the midst of elegant satyr murals and polished marble. That's your promise. The most delicate aspect of your work, not choosing wines, not handling nobility, but speaking to the staff, is about to begin in the middle of the morning. A Roman feast of this magnitude requires people, many people. Furthermore, none of them awoke this morning with the intention of joining another aristocrat in his decadent fever dream. The 23 members of the team, each with a specific duty, are gathered in the atrium. The majority are slaves. Some were born in the home, while others were purchased expressly to carry trays, pour wine, or simply to look good while remaining silent. Some of them are paid entertainers. Everyone is under stress. Cupbearers first. You designate the Central Triclinium, Periphery Lounge, and West Garden as their zones. You remind them to dilute the strong wine until instructed otherwise. Some visitors believe they are capable of handling complete Falernian. They are unable to. The next important job is that of fan bearers. Their timing has the power to make or ruin a visitor's stay. You could blow out a light or reveal someone's secrets with just one too strong gust. Someone perspires into a silk cushion if they are too weak. Neither is appropriate. Fruit attendants, yes, they exist, are trained to remove any fruit that starts to look like a raisin in a discreet manner, peel grapes only when asked, and replenish trays continuously. The musicians are then already arguing over tempo. You keep the lyre player and the flute girl apart. The last time, their argument became so unpleasant that the guests halted the feast in the middle to give the couple marriage counseling. Pretending not to listen, the dancers, all smeared with oil and eyeliner, lean dramatically against a pillar. In any case, you follow their cues. No improvisation, you retort. The Bacchic fire incident is not being reenacted. You look at the 10-year-old boy who is the youngest slave and is in charge of gathering up abandoned sandals. You give one nod, he returns the nod. A silent agreement is reached. He won't let you down. Lastly, you deliver your speech as usual. You are less called upon and unseen tonight. You are less talked to and mute. You embody elegance, grace, and rhythm. Or I'll put you on sponge duty till Saturnalia, I vow, by Jupiter. A pause occurs, then everyone nods. The briefings are finished. You take a breath. The human engine behind Roman debauchery is oiled, powdered, and aligned. For now, it happens every time. The invitations are sent out, the wine is brought in, the silk couches are stuffed, and just when you start to feel a little more in control, someone rushes into the atrium with that familiar expression, and panting. The musicians are still not here. Naturally, they haven't. You clench your jaw. For this particular scenario, you reserved a flute girl, 2 sithara musicians, and a backup Orlos duo. Nevertheless, you find yourself in a gathering where it is seen a civic offense to remain silent. You dispatch your most trustworthy runner to Rome's Subura neighborhood, a tumultuous marketplace full of odors, noise, and poor choices. You locate them, you teach, conscious, alive, and clothed. Why they're late isn't even questioned. You're aware already. Either they are still asleep, too inebriated to move, or they are caught up in a romantic entanglement that started at last night's Saturnalia practice and hasn't ended. The dancers are now griping that they are unable to practice without musicians. Presuming this translates into greater stage time, the poets are thrilled. You soon put an end to that notion. At a party, when guests are enjoying sugared dormice, nobody wants to hear Gaius's ode to his mother's 3rd marriage performed. You think about backup strategies. On a broken reed pipe, the home chef can sing 2 songs. If kept off the booze, a nearby slave has a good singing voice. The worst situation? As someone shakes a jar of lentils, you hum in time. You hope that's not the case. The musicians then come, fashionably unkempt, vaguely sorry, and smelling strongly of spikenard and bad choices like ghosts rising from incense. A sandal has gone missing from one of the flute girls. The other appears to have experienced heartbreak from at least 3 senators. They're here, though. Their stations are assigned by you. One in the garden for ambience, one by the main dining hall, and one in the atrium. You're anxious. Unless someone is truly dying, there should be no abrupt solos, dirges, or sudden tempo changes. They give a nod, in a way. You let out a breath. Averted crisis, for the time being. However, you continue to watch the lyre player. He's tenderly and painstakingly tuning it. Too affectionately for someone who isn't interested in ruining everything with a spontaneous love ballad. You write something down. Place him close to the entrance. Removal is simple. Seating is the plan if music is the lifeblood of the gathering. You're not merely setting up couches for visitors. You're juggling relationships, rivalries, and enough unsaid conflict to bring down a mansion made of marble. 9 people can be accommodated in the traditional 3-couch Roman triclinium. In a technical sense, in a relaxed manner. If no one brings their pet leopard, it will be closer to 7. Like a general organizing a siege, you start by drawing everything out on a wax tablet. The center couch, there, the status is displayed. Only guests of the highest rank are permitted to enter the summus locus, the place of honor. Regretfully, 2 people believe they are that individual. Both Governor Crispus and Senator Pizzo claim the title by virtue of their marriage, birth, and sheer self-confidence. You will have to choose who will receive the top place and who will receive wine that has been mildly poisoned. Additionally, lovers should be kept close to one another, but not too close, unless they are ex-lovers, in which case they should be separated by a bowl of olives and a charming but dull person in between. Then there are the seat fillers, the pleasant but unmemorable people who are there to maintain order. To take in the effect, you put a rich horseman next to a theatrical poet. The poet will enjoy the attention, and the equestrian will not comprehend the poem. The partnership is mutually beneficial. You place courtesans in key places close to the wealthy, the lonely, or the recently divorced. You also assign 2 of them to the west side, not because it matters, but because it will bother Aurelia, and she needs something to complain about other than the wine temperature. Of course, you leave room for unpredictability. Someone will arrive uninvited. Someone will switch seats to make a statement. Someone will spill wine and demand a full reshuffling. You allow for last-minute flexibility, plausible deniability, a few vacant cushions, and a spot for the poet to pout if necessary. When the sitting arrangement is complete, you look at it with the same admiration that a sculptor would have for his marble. even if you know that someone will hammer it before dusk. With this command, you wrap up the scroll and pass it off. Put name tags in wax, and for heaven's sake, make sure no one switches them. At least you tried, even though you know they will. The kitchen is the backstage arena if the orgy is a performance. It has the scent of figs, fire, and pure terror. The entire household is a controlled culinary anarchy by mid-afternoon. The head chef, a former Navy cook who is now a domestic warlord, is already yelling at a scared helper about how to properly stuff roasted dormice. You hear the words honey, poppy seeds, and I will personally throw you into the Tiber. Fantastic, everything is proceeding according to plan. Tonight's big event, peacock. Feathers are reapplied for dramatic effect after being roasted intact. It is served mostly so wealthy guests can boast about chewing something that previously strutted like a diva. And it looks amazing and tastes like shoe leather. A pig that has been filled with live birds is also being prepared in the kitchen. That is a real thing, yes. You surprise everyone by roasting the pig and slicing it open at the table. Doves take off. The doves experience just minimal trauma, yet it's amazing and unnerving. The counters are adorned with platters of honey cakes, dates, and figs. A colosseum-shaped pastry is being glazed. Part of it is inadvertently consumed by a slave. He is immediately put in charge of fetching grapes. A vat of garum, that notorious Roman fish sauce, produced from fermented anchovies, and the tears of anyone within sniffing distance are being stirred in one corner. You loudly remind them not to put it near the bread. Last month's celebration was wrecked by a single loaf soaked in garum, which also sparked a 5-day quarrel between two magistrates. The wine storage is being organized in the meantime. Cheaper vintages for those who won't notice the difference, and amphorae of Falernian for the main guests. You ensure that the amphorae are discreetly labelled. An irate consul with a sensitive palate has literally burnt you before. Tension permeates the entire kitchen, pastry horns packed with mystery, meats larded, sauces reduced, and platters polished. All at once, you're everywhere, sniffing, tasting, directing. You're doing more than just running a kitchen. You are in charge of an appetizing show that is supposed to wow, elicit arouse, and withstand being thrown during a dispute. The head cook barks, I'm feeding them to the peacock if anyone drops another dormouse, as you pass the oven. You give a nod. Everything is going smoothly. You would think choosing a fragrance would be simple. But in ancient Rome, perfume is a statement, and tonight's orgy is no place for amateur olfactory choices. The guests won't just taste and see opulence, they need to smell it. Wealth, temptation, and the kind of self-assurance that only those who bathe in imported rose oil can achieve must be in the air. Entering the storage compartment, you see small alabaster jars arranged like holy relics on the shelves. Arabian myrrh, Ceylonese cinnamon oil, Cilician saffron, and an experimental mixture known as essence of Nile lotus that smells like a pricey pond. You've smelled them all. Twice. Like a war plan, you start writing the fragrant strategy. The atrium will have a crisp, clean opening note with a scent of citrus and cedarwood. The principal triclinium, for stronger smells that is. Myrrh. Frankincense. A hint of musk, it should mutter. It's acceptable if you make a mistake tonight. The sensual combination is delivered to the private garden alcoves where secrets will be shared, and togas will be placed strategically. Cinnamon, rose, and just enough spikenard to knock someone out standing too close. Then there are the scented oils for the feet and hands of visitors. You designate an attendant to provide them a little warmth. Cold oil is not what anyone wants. Barbarians use cold oil. Good lighting and sex are enhanced by warm oil. Yes, you have also scented the restrooms. You're also not a savage. Don't overscent, you tell your employees. Luxury, not suffocation, is what we desire. We've gone too far if a senator enters and claims that his nosebleed is caused by the odor. One of the dancers asks for a seductive personal perfume. You give her a mixture so strong that it once provoked a small-scale riot at a Saturnalia feast. You warn her. She smiles. She'll use it anyway. You walk through the halls, trailing your nose like a trained hound. The warm, spicy, and lavish environment is starting to blossom. Through the triclinium, a fragrant breeze floats like a whispered secret. You give a nod. This is what indulgence smells like. Scented, lit, and fully armed with aroma, the house is nearly ready to receive its guests. All it needs now is chaos. It's late afternoon. The scent of roasted meat, warm citrus, and costly choices fills the air. You've assigned every task, threatened everyone necessary, and bribed the harpist to stay sober until at least dessert. This is the last walk through, the moment of truth. You begin at the entrance, where one by one oil lamps are ignited. They cast a golden glow as they flicker softly on polished marble, saying, "You're not poor, not tonight." Fresh petals are sprinkled at the threshold by a flower boy. You warn him against going overboard. Someone slipped on lavender and sued the last time. Into the atrium. The fountains of bronze are in motion. Grapes are arranged in ridiculously unfeasible pyramids. Unnatural symmetry has been created by beating, fluffing, and positioning pillows. To make one appear less staged, you shift it a little. Decadence should feel natural, even if it took 32 hours and 2 small breakdowns to accomplish. The major event venue, the triclinium, comes next. Every cushion has been dusted, scented, and carefully turned to cover up any wine stains from the senator's disastrous birthday party last month. The tables are low, and the recliners are oriented just right. You perform a bounce test to make sure it's firm enough to last and soft enough to comfort. Action. You examine the blown glass amphorae, bronze platters, silver goblets, and tableware. You decide it adds authenticity, even though the cheese is somewhat sweating and the bread is well prepared. You stealthily extract a fig's bug. Nobody noticed, it didn't occur. The illumination in the garden alcoves is subtle and ambiguous. It is just bright enough to prevent mishaps with potted plants and dignity, but not so brilliant as to be flattering. Incense is fanned by a servant. It has an ethereal effect. You stop and take a moment to savor it. A flower out of position is one of the minor details you notice. You make it right. One more, a slightly uneven curtain. You modify it. A final check. You inhale deeply. You listen. You move through the room as though you were a visitor. It's stunning, absurd, excessive, perfect. You sigh. You briefly convince yourself that everything is under control. Then a person bursts in. 3 additional spouses were brought by the honored guest, who arrived early. Of course he did. You smile tightly, straighten your tunic, and step into the fray. The first knock is not so much a knock as it is a dramatic thump, followed by laughter. You inhale. Let's get started. The door opens. With just enough flair to make an impression without overpowering, a slave draws back the curtain. Lucius Calpurnius Piso, your first visitor, enters the establishment as if he owns it, even though he hasn't paid for anything. His scents include ambition, strong alcohol, and imported cologne that costs more than a soldier's yearly salary. He gives you a wink and a smile. My friend, we made Bacchus blush tonight. A trail of courtesans, a small-time poet, and a man with a little lyre, who might or might not have been invited, followed him. You choose not to look. In flowing robes, gold-threaded tunics, embroidered sandals, and signs of afflicted boredom, guests start to stream in. To demonstrate their importance, they all arrived early, and to demonstrate their relaxation, they all had at least 1 drink. You adjust the wine rations in your mind. Perfume towels are offered by a slave. Rosewater is presented by another. One visitor requests a little amphora of something more Dionysian and declines both. You offer him wine with spices. He refers to it as intellectual. He is not corrected by you. Murmurs, introductions, judgments, and quiet chats that nonetheless sound louder than real speech fill the garden. The whereabouts of the flute girls has previously been inquired about. The fruit pile is being eyed by someone else as if it were a debt. You continue to move, nod, and adapt. Two senators who haven't spoken since the goat insult incident are separated. You see the poets huddled like storm clouds in a corner, with Governor Crispus lounging far too near someone else's wife. One of the dancers enters the center too soon. Your fingers snap. Not quite yet. Timing matters. If everything begins too soon, it loses mystery. Guests complain if it starts too late. You're looking for tension. You desire a simmering scandal. You stealthily pick a grape, pass a serving platter, and continue on your way. One of the guests is already snoring on a pillow, and another is using butter to polish a dagger. So yes, it's going well. For a Roman orgy, controlled chaos is the highest compliment, and tonight you're almost insulted. The lyres are tuned, the flute girls are finally sober, or at least balanced, and the dancers are oiling there like they're about to go into battle. You nod. The show starts. As the first dancer enters the triclinium, golden veils flowing, anklets tinkling, gaze fixated somewhere between divine inspiration and total disinterest, there is a silence. She starts to move. It is elegant, mesmerizing, and just the kind of theatrical sensuality that renders senior senators' poetry. Slow, spiraling sounds from the flute join in, floating across the incense-scented air. The whole feast falls into rhythm for a fleeting, lovely moment. Chewing slows down. Conversations hush. Even the poet stops trying to recite. But then, of course, something goes off script. A guest demands a reenactment of the myth of and the swan. This time, someone uses actual torches to counter Orpheus in the underworld. A third offers a combination of interpretative juggling, a water jug, and nude gladiators. You give them a courteous smile and reassure them that everything is planned. Meanwhile, the mime twins, who were specifically told to wait until the third wine course, enter early and begin miming a scene of seduction involving a fig and a sausage. Half the room laughs, the other half looks confused. One man cheers as loudly as the Pompeian theatre. You fight the need to splash your eyes with wine. The dancers go on, the musicians make an effort to adjust. Perhaps realizing she's playing in the wrong key, you see the harpist improvising a melancholy piece. Then a peach is thrown. It appears to be an accident at first, but then a different visitor tosses a fig back. It's interactive now. You intervene swiftly, hold up your hand, and offer it to Bacchus as a symbolic sacrifice. Everyone applauds. Averted crisis. You decide to never serve fruit that can be thrown again. The entertainment moves quickly. Whispers, laughing, movement, and music. Near the pool, a flame dancer performs. A flute girl stumbles. A guest proposes to a statue. It's chaos. Gorgeous, perfumed, theatrical chaos. And this is where you shine. Orgy planner, stage manager, mood wrangler, fig diplomat. As though any of this was deliberate, you move a lamp, give a server a nod, and move through the darkness in silence. The wine is no longer provided by the third course. People are worshipping it. In full bloom, the guests are sprawled out on their couches like drunken gods, laughing too loudly, flirting too daringly, and losing track of basic details like who they came with. The waitresses have been told by you to purposefully dilute the wine. Falernian is powerful. One amphora can convince a senator to sing poetry or confess to tax fraud. You water down the wine for the ambitious and leave it pure for the already hopeless. It's diplomacy by the jug. The discussions become more intimate and less philosophical. A young nobleman publicly contrasts Jupiter's wealth with his own. A merchant boasts that he has a camel and 3 villas. A joke about the emperor's feet is whispered by a woman wearing pearls. You act as though you're not listening. You will miss her if she is banished. When it comes to seating arrangements, she excels. A poet is attempting to woo a philosopher across the hall with verse that appears to be plagiarized. You hear it just as you pass. Your eyes are salty and black like olives. You don't step in. 2 courtesans are engaged in a passive-aggressive praise war in the meantime. Each smile is a dagger. There's a hint of strategic murder in every laugh. One gives a fruit to the other. You make a note in your mind. By dessert, remove all of the figs. Naturally, someone has chosen to start a gladiator trivia drinking game in the back corner. Someone yells, "Name 3 famous jewels or drink." A junior senator attempts to falsify his response. He is jeered. He consumes alcohol. He starts quoting Virgil after softly collapsing into a cushion. A visitor is speaking in the garden. He thinks that he is being profound. In reality, he is merely describing the number of slaves required to maintain the cleanliness of a marble fountain. Nobody stops him. It's tradition. The wine flows faster now. Amphorae are opened like promises. Cups are never empty. Boundaries are hazy. People forget their names. Stories are exaggerated. The orgy part of the orgy is inching closer. And still, you monitor the flow like a seasoned general. You change the illumination. You turn down the music. You prevent a visitor from consuming perfume. It's getting hot in the orgy. Furthermore, the scandals are only now starting to simmer. The celebration has gone from planned excess to unplanned mythological nonsense by this time in the evening. Visitors no longer use names. Senators with titles are calling each other that guy with the peacocks, Apollo, or Venus. Someone has used table herbs to create a laurel wreath. 3 individuals are visible in the fountain. It looks like one is attempting to baptize the others. You choose not to inquire. Most hosts would freak out at this point. However, calmly, you take a sip of watered wine and start to quietly repair the damage. The mosaic of Neptune has come uncomfortably close to the gladiator wrestling reenactment. Offering them a platter of dates as a diversion, you gently reroute them. It functions. Like tattooed toddlers, they fell for it. You see that 2 of the visitors are absent. You discover them caressing each other's feet and debating stoicism beneath the table. You cough inconspicuously. They pretend to be searching for a misplaced bracelet while nodding. The flute girl has started crying in the west alcove. She took a guest's question about whether her instrument was tuned as a metaphor for something very else. You send a complimentary handful of pomegranate seeds along with the backup lyre player. She gets better. An extremely big man is trying to woo a marble bust of Venus in the atrium. He's feeding it olives carefully while saying lovely nothings. To prevent scandal, you send a servant to gently turn the bust aside. Taking that as a challenge, the man starts reciting poems about love. You let it happen. To be honest, it's preferable to his earlier discussion on grain tariffs. A torch is knocked over. Before it reaches the tapestry, you catch it. You don't wince, you don't perspire. Amidst a storm of satin, grapes, and moral compromise, you remain at the center. Like a high priest of excess, you move around the room rerouting, smoothing, and adjusting. A raised eyebrow that indicates, "Don't throw that goblet, Cassius." A hand on a shoulder, and a glance across the room. He puts it down. He knows better. This is your art, your chaos, and you've tamed it just enough. It's not quite over, though. Down the hallway, you can clearly hear someone pushing a wine cart. You sip again. Dawn is almost here. With all the nuance of a fallen amphora, dawn breaks. The bloodshed is illuminated as sunlight slinks across the marble floors. a nobleman sleeping face down in a beautiful urn, a sandal wedged in a fruit bowl, and overturned goblets. Sputtering out are the oil lamps. The scent has mellowed to something like regret. You step carefully over a passed-out flute player and begin your final round of damage assessment. The cushions are askew. Numerous togas are draped over sculptures in ways that can be considered evidence or art. Someone wrote a philosophical limerick on the wall in wine. It doesn't rhyme, but it is surprisingly insightful. You find your way to the triclinium. A pile of olives has been arranged into a crude likeness of the emperor. You consider preserving it, then quietly kick it under the table. The slaves begin the silent ritual of post-orgy cleanup. The sheets are bundled together and stained with wine. Carried away are half-eaten peacocks. Ash from incense was swept into tidy, respectable mounds. You give instructions in a hushed voice, as though speaking too loudly might awaken the deeper chaos. You check on the guest list, everyone accounted for. No deaths, 1 sprained ankle, 2 spontaneous marriages. A parting philosopher left one very courteous message that only says, "Thank you. I've discovered stuff I should never discuss." Debrief is the title of the list you create. It says to never serve fruit that can be thrown. Live poetry contests should not be held next to open flames. Store the Venus statue for upcoming occasions. Keep Crispus away from anyone who is represented by counsel. A loud moan comes from beneath the table. You recognize with a nod, but you don't help. The celebration is ended. Everybody has to deal with their own repercussions. Doves from the pig-burst performance are still roving around the garden. You toss them some leftover candied almonds after gently guiding them into a corner. After the night they've had, they deserve something delicious. You look around one last time. It was a complete disaster, a victory, a grape-related diplomatic nightmare. And you made it through it. After retiring to your room, you take off your sandals and fall onto your mat. No applause, no awards, just the knowledge that no one saw the chaos because you absorbed it. Tomorrow, they'll tell stories about how perfect it was. You'll simply go to sleep. Started with a whisper of wind, dry, crackling, bitter. Once rich and black, the immense plains soil had turned to powder, and now that powder was taking to the skies. As their land and future literally blew away, farmers who had previously danced in bright wheat fields remained helpless. For families from Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and eastern Colorado, the land itself turned against them during the terrible 1930s. They had trusted the soil. That was the tragedy. In order to create room for row after row of wheat, hundreds of families had ploughed up native grasses under the encouragement of government incentives and promises of wealth. They were not informed, however, that the land was held in place solely by those native grasses. And they didn't come back after the rain stopped in 1931. The drought grew more severe year after year. The topsoil had nothing to hold it down in the absence of roots. As the wind swept it away in ever-thickening clouds, it started to lift. Abruptly, the storms arrived. The sky was blue at one point. Then, as if darkness had descended in the middle of the day, it was dark. Entire communities were engulfed by dust walls hundreds of feet high. Livestock choked to death. Automobiles stalled. Dust pneumonia struck children. Mothers used damp towels to seal windows and jammed newspapers into door openings. Yet dust continued to seep in and cover dishes, furniture, and lungs. It became known as the Dust Bowl. A storm so large that some thought the world was ending blew across the plains on April 14, 1935, which will always be remembered as Black Sunday. According to reports, a preacher in Oklahoma advised his followers to return home and get ready for judgment. For thousands of people, that storm, which lasted more than 200 miles, turned day into night and blacked out the sun. And a realization followed. They were unable to remain. There was no more soil. The crops have vanished. The animals were perishing. Kids were spitting up dirt. A place of optimism had turned into a cemetery for dreams, and so, with battered pickup trucks, jellies held together with wire, and everything they owned strapped to the roof, families turned west, in the direction of California, in the direction of survival. Anything better than this, towards something. On the other side, they had no idea what was waiting for them. However, they were aware of their escape route. It was also catching up to them. There was no gold on the West Road. Desperation paved the way. An exodus unlike any other in American history started when the Dust Bowl tore through the plains. Families packed into creaky Chevrolets and Fords, frequently with more kids than seats and 4 flat tires. They used rope to lash down everything they owned, including treasures, mattresses, washboards, and kettles. They ended up in a dream, California. The artery of escape became Route 66. It wound through New Mexico, Arizona, and into the Central Valley of California, extending from the Dust Bowl states to the Pacific. It was more than just a road to many. It served as a lifeline. Camps appeared next to petrol stations. Towns along the route grew with migrants, and any rest area with running water turned into a makeshift residence. Thousands of them arrived. During the 1930s, an estimated 2.5 million people left the southern plains. The majority worked as field hands, sharecroppers, and part-time farmers. They fled behind homes they could no longer live in, fields they couldn't save, and mortgages they couldn't afford. Many people never turned around. As they reached the state line, some sobbed. However, California was not what they had envisioned as the promised land. Ads in the newspapers had promised beautiful fields and farm jobs. However, the truth was much more brutal. Much of the economy had already been choked off by the Great Depression by the time the majority of migrants arrived. Wages were less than what was needed to survive, and work was in short supply. Officers from the California Highway Patrol started turning away persons who appeared to be too impoverished at the state border. Regardless of whether they were native to Oklahoma or not, these migrants were referred to as Okies and were treated with distrust and frequently downright animosity. They would bring sickness, crime, or worse, competition for limited employment, the locals feared. Nevertheless, the travelers continued. They slept under cardboard and tarps in temporary settlements known as Hoovervilles, after President Hoover, whom many held responsible for their predicament. They harvested cotton, grapes, peaches, and whatever else that was in season in the fields. Their kids worked next to them, frequently in the intense heat. A little bread or beans could be purchased with a day's wages. But despite their shame and starvation, they held on to hope. I hope the next field will pay more. That California would fulfill its dream in the end. That the road went to a better place, despite its length and dust, because going back meant giving up, not just being unable to do so. They weren't prepared to do it either. The suffering followed them to California, but not the dust. The thousands of families that came in search of a better life were met with a hostile reception from the locals and overcrowded, filthy migrant camps. On the edges of cities and orchards, entire settlements of tents, shacks, and improvised shelters appeared. These were areas for survival, not residences. Families crowded into shelters constructed out of cardboard, canvas, tin scraps, and salvaged wood. Privacy was scarce. The water was supplied via communal pumps. Frequently, restrooms were merely excavated pits that were used by numerous people. Illness spread quickly. Both young and old were weakened by malnutrition. Infants screamed for milk. Parents prayed for employment. Even though the air was cleaner than that of Oklahoma, the atmosphere was oppressive. There was simmering tension. The migrants were viewed as a threat by the local Californians. They were correct to worry that salaries would be lowered by the influx of desperate workers. Now growers could pay pennies for labor-intensive field work, confident that someone would be in need enough to accept it. Wages consequently fell. Things got worse. Exploitation was commonplace. The federal government was occasionally the only place where the migrants could find safety. A few labor camps, such as the one at Arvin, California, were established by the Farm Security Administration, or FSA, to provide basic dignity, medical attention, and sanitary facilities. These were not your typical government camps. Well prepared, tidy, even democratic. Residents resolved conflicts internally and elected committees. However, they were insufficient. The majority of families resided in the unofficial, anarchic communities that surrounded the agricultural valleys outside of this safety net. Police frequently harassed them, irate mobs drove them out of places, or they had to constantly move to avoid being discovered. They were called vagrants by the local authorities. Some kids were not allowed to attend school. Others couldn't make there because they were too ill or too busy working in the fields. Nevertheless, a resilient culture developed within these settlements. Around campfires, guitars were played. They related tales, they ate together, they sang. Their suffering and tenacity were expressed via songs like Hard Travelin' and Do Re Mi. These were not merely melancholy ballads, they were survival anthems, because they maintained their sense of community even after life deprived them of their house, land, and security. Strength also came with community. They had little money. They weren't broken, though. And in the midst of the hunger, something strong started to develop gradually. Solidarity. Childhood was not a period of play for the children of Dust Bowl migrants. It was a daily endurance workout. They frequently used sticks as toys. They played their games next to roadside camps in dirt lots. Additionally, their classrooms were agricultural fields. America's youth were already under stress from the Great Depression. However, poverty added a layer of dust and displacement for these kids. They were not immune to the conflict, they participated in it. For a few pennies a day, even small children would labor alongside their parents, picking beans, cotton, or grapes. By the conclusion of each shift, some of them were as young as 6, their little fingers bruised and blistered. Attending school was a luxury. Relocation caused disruption all the time. It was time to relocate once more by the time they started attending a new school. Additionally, they were frequently not welcomed at school if they attended at all. They were called Okie kids, and occasionally even their teachers made fun of them. They were immediately identified by their tattered, sun-bleached, and frequently shared apparel. They were distinguished by their accents, their skin bitten by dust, and their hunger-induced quiet. Some schools flatly refused to accept them. Others made them clean the restrooms before class. Nevertheless, these kids grew a unique tenacity in the face of hardship. While their parents were at work, they learned how to look after their younger siblings. They helped stretch meals of beans, cornmeal, and fat. They carried bottles of water to the fields, and they repaired damaged shoes with shreds of rubber. There were minor victories in spite of the odds. On occasion, relief organizations offered soap, literature, and even temporary schools. Children might read, laugh, and learn, if only briefly, at the few stable government camps. It wasn't much, but it was a start for a child who had experienced hunger, homelessness, and dust storms. Some people grew up to recall these years as ones of camaraderie as well as deprivation. Despite their poverty, families were close-knit. Lifelong friendships were formed via shared labor, music, and storytelling. The kids had each other, even though they didn't have toys, birthdays, or summer vacations. As they matured, many of them maintained that fortitude into adulthood, becoming the first members of their families to complete high school, land a steady job, or enlist in the military for the impending conflict. Yes, they were children of dust, but they were also children of willpower. The stories of the Dust Bowl migrants did not disappear as they worked in the camps and farms of California. They became a song. When words alone were insufficient, music evolved into a weapon and a source of solace, a means of protesting injustice and upholding dignity. The suffering, pride, and tenacity of the migrants were brought to life in the lyrics of folk melodies and the rhythm of guitar strings. This was never more apparent than in Woody Guthrie's music. Guthrie, who was originally from Oklahoma, became the voice of the dislocated. He picked in the same fields, slept in the same camps, and traveled with migrants. He sung about what he observed. He didn't write abstract songs. They gave names to actual locations, hardships, and heartaches. For instance, Do Re Mi cautioned hopeful newcomers that California was not the utopia they had dreamed of. California is a pleasure to live in or visit, but if you don't have the Do Re Mi, you won't find it to be that hot. Guthrie's songs, whether shouted out loud or played on harmonicas or worn guitars, reverberated through dusty camps. They were transferred from worker to worker and from tent to tent. These were oral histories, not merely songs. They reassured the audience that they were not alone. They transformed their common suffering into power. Guthrie wasn't alone, though. Migrants sang their own songs about the hard journey west, ruthless foremen, lost farms, and dreams of a better future, all over the camps. When governments and journalists refused to tell the truth, these songs did. They talked about broken hopes, police harassment, hunger, and exploitation, but they also talked about love, faith, and resistance. This song became a part of a broader cultural movement and had an impact on the burgeoning American folk scene. It made the grim realities of life for Dust Bowl refugees known to audiences beyond of California. It increased empathy. Activism was sown. These songs eventually contributed to the growth of reform support. They gave numbers a human face. They cut right through apathy. They contested the myth that immigrants were unwelcome or idle. They demonstrated otherwise in music. Because the music persisted even when the land failed, the labor was harsh and the people were antagonistic. When bodies hunger, it fed spirits. It provided the voiceless with a voice. And it served as a reminder to all the men, women, and children living under a canvas roof. You are important, you belong, and you persevere. In addition to their songs, the migrants discovered a voice in literature that would reverberate well beyond the fields and camps. That voice belonged to John Steinbeck, a Californian who lived through the Dust Bowl exodus and turned the suffering of the dispossessed into The Grapes of Wrath, one of the most influential books in American history. The Grapes of Wrath, which was published in 1939, chronicled the trek west and the harsh reality of migrant life for the fictional Joad family, who were Okies from Oklahoma. Even though the characters were made up, their pain was genuine. Steinbeck had interviewed families, visited migrant camps, and meticulously chronicled their experiences. What he saw infuriated him: wage theft, police brutality, malnutrition, and the degradation of human dignity. He wasn't kind in his remarks. They were unflinching, angry, and raw. He told of women performing backbreaking labor while concealing pregnancy, men crumbling under humiliation, and infants starving to death. The impoverished were not romanticized by Steinbeck. He paid them respect. He observed a tenacity in them that defied death. The book caused quite a stir. It was deemed un-American by some. Steinbeck was criticized by growers and municipal authorities who accused him of defamation and exaggeration. Copies of the book were even set on fire by one chamber of commerce in California. However, readers throughout were unable to turn away. The anonymous Okies now had names, backstories, and living hearts. Steinbeck's writing accomplished more than just increase consciousness. It demanded action. Together with the Grapes of Wrath's popularity, his reports put pressure on the federal government to look into labor violations and enhance migrant circumstances. It made a crisis that many people would have liked to ignore more widely known. It also kept a record which is equally significant. Steinbeck's tale endured long after the camps had dispersed and the winds had calmed. For the children and grandchildren of the Dust Bowl migrants, it served as a reminder that their hardship had been noticed, and that what their ancestors had gone through was significant. The grapes of wrath yelled at a time when it was assumed that the impoverished would suffer in silence. Many people in the country listened to its demand, because protest signs and songs aren't always the most effective forms of resistance. It's a narrative. No one else could tell it the way Steinbeck did. The federal government, led by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, was compelled to take action as the Dust Bowl migrants poured into California, and the American people started to realize the extent of the catastrophe. The pain was just too obvious to ignore. Youngsters were going hungry, the camps were full, desperate workers crowded the fields. In addition, America's reputation as the country of opportunity was rapidly deteriorating. Roosevelt's comprehensive set of policies aimed at rescuing the nation from the Great Depression is known as the New Deal. The New Deal was a turning point, even though it didn't address all of the issues that migrants faced. To provide assistance, restore dignity, and try long-term solutions, organizations such as the Resettlement Administration and later the Farm Security Administration, FSA, were established. The predicament of displaced rural families was a special focus of the FSA. In California and other states, it constructed government-run work camps and organized communities with access to clean water, sanitary facilities, healthcare, educational institutions, and even playgrounds. Despite their lack of luxury, these camps served as havens for families who had previously slept in roadside tents and ditches. Some of the only democratic environments these families had ever experienced were created when the locals chose their own leaders and resolved conflicts among themselves. The camps developed into cultural refugees as well. There were music events, libraries, and even English and farming schools. For many, they served as the cradle of a new, rural American identity that prioritized pride, unity, and self-governance. The New Deal provided employment outside of the camps through the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, and the Works Progress Administration, WPA, although these were sometimes inaccessible to temporary migrants. However, one of the most enduring gifts was made in the form of documentation rather than cash. Dorothea Langs was part of a team of photographers dispatched by the FSA to document the crisis's human impact. Her eerie image, Migrant Mother, instantly came to represent the hardships of the Dust Bowl. It provided a face to the faceless. It provided a voice to the disregarded. However, not everyone benefited from all relief initiatives. The same people who needed assistance the most were frequently left out by racism, bureaucratic red tape, and local opposition. However, the New Deal was more than just a law for many families. It served as a lifeline. It demonstrated that the government was finally making an effort to pay attention. Help arrived before it was too late, for once. Many Dust Bowl migrants were no longer merely surviving by the late 1930s, they were planning. They had reached a tipping point as a result of years of exploitation, broken promises, and dehumanizing working conditions. What started off as silent complaints in the fields developed into a movement. The agricultural valleys of California saw a surge in labor rallies, boycotts, and strikes as migrants called for more pay, safer working conditions, and fundamental human rights. The gamble was risky. Growers held great power. They were supported by the police, money, and political connections. Workers on strike were frequently run out of town, beaten, or jailed. Some were prohibited from working in the future. Employed enforcers attacked others. However, the workers refused to back down in spite of the danger. A uncommon but crucial support system was provided by organizations like the United Cannery, Agricultural, Packing, and Allied Workers of America, or UCAPAWA, and the Cannery and Agricultural Workers Industrial Union. These unions taught workers how to document injustices, negotiate, and protest peacefully, while frequently being underfunded and dispersed. Joining a strike was more than just a financial decision for many migrants, particularly women. It had to do with voice. Children in the arms of mothers marched. In picket lines, teenage girls stood next to their fathers. Whole families were expelled from certain camps for attempting to form a union. But the bravery persisted. Massive cotton strikes occurred in the San Joaquin Valley in 1933 and 1934. Thousands of people quit their jobs. Growers used violence and intimidation to try to slow the strike's momentum, but it garnered national attention, and after weeks of protest, workers were granted a small pay increase, proof that resistance could succeed. These uprisings were chronicled by writers and journalists. Photographers documented weary but unyielding picketers. Although their most well-known work would come later, labor organizers Luisa Moreno and Dolores Huerta stood on the shoulders of these early migrant groups. Not all of the Dust Bowl refugees were destitute and impoverished. They were fighters, survivors, and political players. They refused to be hushed, despite the fact that their clothing revealed their poverty and their accents identified them as outsiders. They were no longer merely victims of the economy and the weather. The story was now being shaped by them. By advocating for themselves, they started to alter not only their own lives, but also the course of American labor in the future, and their struggle was only getting started. The worst of the Dust Bowl was over by the early 1940s. At last, the plains saw rain again. The strains of World War II helped the economy start to recover. After moving from field to field, many migrant families were able to find stable employment, permanent houses, and a tenuous sense of normalcy. However, the exodus had already profoundly and irrevocably changed American society on a political, cultural, and emotional level. The kids who previously gathered fruit under a scorching heat went on to serve in the armed forces, use the GI Bill to go to college, and start their own families. Some returned to farming, but this time they showed more regard for the soil and conservation. Others relocated to places like Bakersfield and Los Angeles, where they established the groundwork for working-class neighborhoods that still exist today. The Dust Bowl migration changed California's culture. Okies, who were initially viewed as outsiders, eventually assimilated into the state. Their ideals, language, and music merged with regional customs to create new genres, such as the Bakersfield sound in country music, which was popularized by musicians like Merle Haggard, who was a migrant's son. They simply found other methods to communicate, but the hurt and pride of those years never went away. The Grapes of Wrath became a literary staple on American bookshelves, serving as a reminder of the country's cruelty as much as its kindness. In terms of politics, the Dust Bowl era fueled the fight for land conservation, labor rights, and a greater understanding of the necessity of a social safety net. The lessons weren't simply historical, they were environmental. America learned the dangers of land abuse during the Dust Bowl. Farming practices were changed, soil conservation districts were created, and ecological stewardship gained national attention. Although the scars from careless farming were severe, they were not forgotten, and the resilience that resulted from it may have lasted the longest. These travelers had experienced starvation, hate, economic ruin, and the fury of nature. They had been thrown aside, locked out, and spat on. However, they persevered, adjusted, and contributed to the development of the contemporary West. The tales of adversity and perseverance are still carried by descendants of Dust Bowl migrants today. They remember in the chords of a Guthrie song, in old camp pictures, and in dusty family albums. The Dust Bowl was a pivotal period in American history, not merely a catastrophe. Yes, one written in dust, but one written in resolve as well. Imagine a world without Google, books, or paper, just voice and memory. For the majority of our existence, that was the situation in almost every human society. Knowledge was maintained through oral traditions, songs, and stories even before alphabets were etched into stone or ink was poured onto paper. Oral tradition was the main force behind civilization itself, not just a way to transmit knowledge. Memory was considered a sacred obligation in ancient communities. Stories served as vehicles for identification, morality, the law, and survival, in addition to being recounted for amusement. Laws, conventions, taboos, ancestral lineages, and creation myths were all transmitted by elders. Hunters used rhythmic recitations to recall the terrain, farmers used seasonal chants to understand planting cycles, and parents used stories and parables to teach their children valuable life skills. The voice conveyed all the important information, including our identity, origins, and way of life. Accuracy was important because there was no written backup. To preserve knowledge, oral civilizations evolved complex memory strategies: meter, rhyme, rhythm, and repetition. These were mnemonic devices rather than aesthetic decisions. There was a reason why stories were structured. Epics and chants had to be memorable. That was their purpose. Forgetting wasn't a mistake, it was a cultural catastrophe in a society where the past only existed in people's mouths and thoughts. Oral tradition, however, was always adaptable and receptive. There was a pulse of the present in every retelling. Depending on the situation, a storyteller may modify their tale for a different audience or change the focus. As a result, oral knowledge became a live, breathing repository that was both durable and flexible. It walked, spoke, danced, and sung. It wasn't kept on dusty shelves. The social power of storytellers themselves was enormous. They were regarded as sacred in many cultures. They were truth-tellers and memory keepers, not merely entertainers. They served as political advisors or spiritual mentors in some locales. In others, they were solely in charge of conserving centuries' worth of knowledge. A nation's history could be lost if a master storyteller were to go. Without written language, societies did not become ignorant. They prospered in other ways. Generational continuity was guaranteed by oral tradition. Time was sewn together. It linked the past to the future, the living to the dead, and the individual to the community. And it continues to do so in many parts of the world. History strolls and converses in the center of West Africa. It sings, it recalls. It is embodied in the voice of the griot, a multifaceted individual who serves as a spiritual advisor, genealogy, singer, historian, storyteller, and diplomat. Griots have maintained centuries of memory without ever writing a word in societies ranging from Guinea to Senegal to Mali. The griot's function is not merely cultural, it is vital. Entrusted with the collective wisdom of clans, lineages, and empires, griots serve as the custodians of oral archives for the peoples and others. Every village name has a legend behind it, and they are aware of who married whom, who fought which war, and what treaties were made. Without hesitation, a griot can recite a genealogy spanning dozens of generations. This is not a light-hearted tale. Griots must endure rigorous apprenticeship for years, even decades. They are taught to learn intricate melodies on ancient instruments like the kora, remember hundreds of lines of verse, and comprehend the spiritual, political, and historical significance of every word from an early age. Oral transmission of knowledge occurs between generations, from master to apprentice. Griots frequently advise monarchs and rulers in royal courts. The griot provides historical precedent, reminding leaders of past errors or ancient vows when a monarch is faced with a significant decision, such as whether to go to war, marry into a rival clan, or form an alliance. In this way, griots serve as moral pillars in addition to being entertainers. They play a part in maintaining leadership continuity, legitimacy, and wisdom. Griots continue to have an impact in the digital era. They play at naming ceremonies, weddings, funerals, and national gatherings. Their experiences serve as a reminder to communities of their identity and accomplishments. Through their voice, griots are able to maintain their identity and solidarity in the face of centuries of change. Griots served as a living protest against colonialism's attempt to obliterate African history by ignoring oral traditions. They demonstrated that memory could persist outside of written records, and that oral tradition was profound rather than archaic. In actuality, griots who never stopped singing provide us with a large portion of what we currently know about empires like Mali or Songhai, rather than colonial documents. They are living time machines and walking libraries. Large portions of African history would have disappeared in their absence. The Pacific Ocean's inhabitants were already skilled navigators thousands of years before GPS or compasses were invented. They traveled thousands of miles from island to island in small boats, mapping one of the world's largest bodies of water. They lacked written instructions and maps. Their oral tradition, which was stored in the blood and bones of memory rather than books, was a profound embodied knowledge that was passed down from one generation to the next. The wayfinders, skilled navigators who relied on the stars, ocean waves, cloud formations, bird flight patterns, and even the color of the water to guide them, were at the center of this practice. This information was not a hunch. It wasn't documented, but it was accurate, having been tried and proven over many generations of travel. It was taught over many years in sacred training and was committed to memory through chants, hymns, and visualizations. The star compass employed by Polynesian navigators is among the most well-known instances of this oral memory technique. In accordance with the rising and setting of the stars, this mental map separated the horizon into distinct points. Every star has seasonal time, meaning, and direction. Like a live GPS, wayfinders would recite these stars in a specific order, ingraining whole routes into their brains. Not all of the knowledge was limited to astronomy. Because navigation meant more than just travel, navigators committed island sequences, historical trip narratives, ocean surges, seasonal winds, and oral genealogies of their own ancestry to memory. Identity was at issue. Sailing the ocean meant following in your ancestors' footsteps and re-establishing your bond with them on each journey. Cultural history was also preserved through oral tradition. They reverently recounted Genesis legends, tales of huge migrations, and the exploits of legendary mariners. These stories weren't merely for amusement, they were survival manuals. They provided information on where to find fresh water, when to travel, which reefs to avoid, and which omens to pay attention to. The precision of these navigators astounded European explorers upon their arrival in the Pacific. Centuries later, contemporary academics started to realize the enormous cognitive sophistication that underlies their knowledge, which some had previously written off as luck or instinct. Because remembering means navigating, speaking means sailing, and forgetting means becoming lost at sea, Polynesian voyaging communities are resurrecting these oral traditions today and teaching the next generation how to find their way without the aid of technology. Bards traveled from town to town, telling epic stories that would come to define Western literature even before the written word established itself in Greek civilization. One of these storytellers was Homer, whose name reverberated for millennia. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey are imposing examples of the force of oral tradition, regardless of whether he was a single historical character or a composite of multiple voices. These were more than just tales. They were performed in real time. The Homeric epics were passed down from bard to bard, memorized in their entirety, and recited aloud, frequently with the lyre accompanying. There are more than 15,000 lines of verse in the Iliad alone. How was it possible to recall everything? Oral composition, formulaic language, repetition, and nicknames like swift-footed Achilles or rosy-fingered Dawn hold the key to the solution. These repeated sentences weren't merely lyrical flourishes, they served as memory aids, clues woven throughout the story to keep the actor on course. Flexibility was possible with this oral composing technique. there was never exactly the same recitation twice. Depending on the audience, a bard could lengthen or abbreviate the story, highlighting certain emotional beats or incorporating local heroes. In this sense, the epic's essence stayed intact while being updated by successive generations, according to oral tradition. The Homeric epics were not just for amusement, they were collective identity, historical memory, and moral education. Greek audiences learned about honor, loyalty, guile, fate, and the will of the gods via the tales of Odysseus and Troy. By reaffirming common values and reminding audiences of their role in the fabric of myth and memory, the performances served to unite communities. Homer's writings were read aloud for centuries after the creation of writing. The epics were eventually written down by the Greeks, but not before they had influenced Greek religion, education, and philosophy. They were repeated in classrooms, became pillars of classical education, and appeared in the writings of playwrights and philosophers. One achievement of the oral world is the persistence of Homer's stories. They survived longer than many civilizations, despite not being inscribed in stone. They serve as a reminder that with proper care and organization, human memory may rival books in terms of durability. Because reciting Homer meant holding history in your breath in ancient Greece, not merely telling a narrative. Without the use of written language, the indigenous peoples of North America had developed sophisticated, affluent civilizations long before European contact. All of their scientific knowledge, laws, cosmologies, and histories were passed down orally. Spoken word was a sacred power for these tribes, not just a means of communication. Not only were stories recounted, but they were also shared and transferred with duty and regard, much like ceremonial items. Every nation, including the Hopi, Lakota, Navajo, and Haudenosaunee, had its own oral traditions that were appropriate for its social organization, cosmology, and terrain. Creation myths described how the world came into being, as well as how people were supposed to live in it. Animal myths imparted virtues like humility, bravery, and respect. Records of migration, conflict, treaties, and interactions with foreigners were recorded by historical narratives. In order to strengthen connection and identity, these tales were frequently repeated in the winter when families congregated in longhouses or around fire circles. The storytellers, who were frequently elders or spiritual leaders, were picked for their integrity as much as their memory. They needed to be precise. Unless it was part of a rite, embellishment was discouraged. Many stories have appropriate openings, sacred sequences, and rigid structures. A misreported narrative was disrespectful in addition to being untrue. Oral tradition not only maintained myth and history, but also useful knowledge. Over generations, indigenous peoples transmitted knowledge orally about fire ecology, agricultural systems, astrological tracking, and herbal medicine. Knowing what plants were good for healing wounds, when to plant, where to hunt, or how to read the stars. Manuals didn't mention this. It was passed down from elders to young people, frequently through ceremonies, songs, or stories. Oral memory was even the foundation of diplomacy. The great rule of peace, an epic constitution that was kept through wampum belts and ceremonial speech rather than parchment, was recited orally by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, one of the earliest participatory democracies in the world. Because they were unaware that they were addressing countries with rich legal and intellectual traditions, European colonists sometimes disregarded oral culture as inferior when they first arrived. That spoken world still exists today in many areas. Indigenous elders continue to transmit songs, names, and wisdom in spite of centuries of cultural erasure and forced assimilation. Understanding that stories perish along with language, some tribes are recreating storytelling traditions to revive endangered languages. But memory endures as long as there is a voice, and nations survive because of it. The sacred traveled via speech even before holy books were put on altars and bound in leather. The original teachings of almost all major religious traditions were transmitted orally rather than on scrolls, and were recounted, committed to memory, and kept by loyal adherents. In these religions, oral traditions served as more than just a means of communication. The very thing that brought illumination was it. Consider one of the world's oldest continuously practiced religions, Hinduism. The founding texts of Hinduism, the Vedas, were passed down orally for centuries before being recorded in writing. Pandits, sometimes called Brahmins, are Sanskrit priests who were taught to memorize large amounts of material from an early age, including every syllable and intonation. The Vedas were sounds that were thought to possess cosmic power rather than merely words. Precision was crucial. The spiritual influence could be distorted by mispronouncing words. Oral recitation was therefore approached with accuracy, cadence, and respect. Muslims believe that the Quran is the exact word of God as it was given to the Prophet Muhammad. It is recited rather than written down. Millions of Muslims still commit the whole Quran to memory, a practice known as becoming a hafiz. Here, the oral tradition is essential to the text rather than an add-on. Passed down from teacher to pupil, the musical cadence of Quranic recitation upholds spiritual significance and ties the listener to centuries of uninterrupted transmission. Christianity started out as an oral tradition as well. Prior to the writing of the Gospels, the parables, the early miracles, and the stories of Jesus were told out loud in assemblies. Preachers of early Christianity traveled from village to village, addressing audiences, engaging in debate, and winning people over. The majority of the congregation was illiterate even after the New Testament was compiled. Instead of being read, faith was nevertheless heard. They sang psalms. They delivered sermons. Before eyes, scripture existed in ears. The foundation of rabbinic instruction in Judaism is oral tradition. Important Jewish legal and interpretive books, the Mishnah and Talmud, were originally passed down orally through intricate networks. Rabbis frequently committed thousands of lines to memory before anything was committed to pen as they debated and discussed teachings out loud. Oral tradition made sure that the divine remained alive, active, spoken, and sung in all religions. Believers still carry out these customs today. Mantras are mumbled, prayers are recited, and scripture is chanted. For the faithful, the sacred is more than just written words. It is also heard, remembered, and breathed by people. Oral tradition was used by cultures all throughout the world to preserve intricate legal systems long before there were contemporary courtrooms and documented legal codes. Justice was administered orally through memorization and through performance rather than by reading from a book. Legal knowledge was a living memory in ancient civilizations, passed down by elders, leaders, judges, and councils who made sure that justice, responsibility, and punishment were recalled and upheld. For generations, the Gaelic Browns of Ireland relied solely on oral justice. Trained legal experts who committed thousands of verses and precedents to memory passed down the Brehon Rules, a complex and thorough body of legal principles that governed everything from honour debts to property disputes. These judges carried legacy rather than books. To help with memory and maintain consistency, they used lyrical form and exact wording while reciting decisions, citing earlier rulings. Many societies in sub-Saharan Africa used councils and elders to administer justice orally. According to Igbo, Zulu, or Ashanti customs, legal disputes were settled in public forums where witnesses testified, testimony was given, and decisions were reached by consensus. The lack of writing did not imply a lack of organization. The spoken word was supreme, elders were the archives, and memory was the law. Oral justice systems were also employed by Native American cultures in North America to settle disputes and preserve peace. The Great Law of Peace, an oral constitution that was reinforced by wampum belts and beaded mnemonic devices, was as the foundation for the Haudenosaunee Confederacy's condolence ceremonies and consensus-based decision-making. Stories, myths, and metaphors frequently contained laws that reinforced virtues like accountability, respect, and reciprocity. These oral systems were flexible and not inflexible. Without having to update written scripts, they could adapt to new realities as times change. Because of its adaptability, oral law became vibrant, ingrained in society, and frequently more restorative than punitive. Many oral law traditions were disregarded as archaic or inferior when colonial powers enforced written legal systems, but they were anything but. They were historically aware, focused on the community, and intended to preserve social harmony rather than just uphold the rule of law. A few of these oral legal systems are being honored and revitalized today. Traditional justice approaches are being incorporated into formal systems in nations like Canada and New Zealand, not because they are outdated, but rather because they are effective. Because justice in oral law is something you hear, something you remember, and something your community understands. It is not something you read. The human storyteller is at the center of all oral traditions. The storyteller serves as a performer, educator, and steward of cultural memory, in addition to being a narrator. They employ speech, gesture, rhythm, and passion to turn memories into a living experience, whether they are seated by a village fire or in front of a royal court. Storytelling is an art form with organization, training, and purpose in oral societies. It is not merely an act. The best instrument for telling a story is memory, but this isn't memory as most people understand it. Those who tell stories are frequently trained from an early age, learning stories word for word, gesture for gesture, and tone for tone. Before they can tell a story of their own, they must learn by apprenticeship, spending years listening to masters. Accuracy is important. Though flexibility is also a part of the profession, a single detail can distort a sacred narrative or falsify a lineage. A skilled storyteller is able to modify content, tone, or timing to fit various audiences, situations, or emotional moods. Performance is essential in all civilizations. With just a fan and a piece of fabric, rakugo performers in Japan sit on stage and use timing, facial expressions, and pitch adjustments to bring entire casts of characters to life. The Kathakal tradition in India retells ancient epics like the Mahabharata with dance, mime, and song. Griots in West Africa transform history into music by accompanying their recitations with instruments such as the kora. Thus, storytelling is dynamic. Memory serves as the screenplay for this theatre. There is never a passive audience. Storytelling is communal in oral cultures. Listeners react, laugh, and gasp. They are familiar with the stories, yet they want to hear them again because the way they are presented is just as important as the content. Depending on the talent of the narrator, a well-known myth can seem novel, fresh, or even revelatory. Crucially, narrative is more than just amusement. It's survival, law, ritual, education, and history. A child may learn which plants are toxic from a narrative. It might encode taboo and familial norms or instructions across a desert. The lesson is frequently obscured by metaphor and only becomes clear to mature individuals. Thus, the storyteller is a fundamental aspect of culture. They echo generations when they talk. They embody the past rather than merely recalling it. Because memory in oral tradition is embodied in people rather than texts, and whole civilizations communicate with them when they speak, it may appear that oral tradition has become less important in a world where screens, algorithms, and cloud storage rule the day. In reality, though, it's not dying, it's changing. Spoken history has gained new channels, audiences, and influence in the digital age rather than being erased. The importance of memory, voice, and narrative has returned not only in spoken word poetry, podcasts, voice notes, and viral videos, but also in ancient rites. Although the medium has evolved, people's natural tendency to recall by speaking has not. Ironically, social media has reverted us to an earlier era. In 60 seconds, TikTok makers narrate contemporary tales. For millions, YouTubers bring myths and folk tales back to life. Podcasts are the new campfires, where people congregate to listen to stories that inspire, educate, or amuse them through headphones rather than fireplaces. Additionally, digital tools are also being employed in many marginalized and indigenous communities to preserve oral history, record elders, and revitalize languages. Additionally, once ignored civilizations are being empowered by technology. Across continents, people are sharing smartphone recordings of grandmothers narrating ancestral stories or kids learning tribal melodies. It is now possible to search and exchange entire oral knowledge archives online. At the touch of a button, thousands of people can now access what was previously only stored in the memory of a single storyteller. However, this poses significant queries. What occurs if a digital file is created from oral tradition? Is it possible for a recorded story to have the same spiritual impact, depth, or vitality as a live performance? Will people in the future still be able to hear, react, and feel a tale in their bones rather than just their ears? Oral tradition is given permanence by the digital world, but it is also separated from the dynamic exchange that formerly characterized it. Face-to-face storytelling conveys camaraderie, emotion, gestures, and stillness. The listener's age, the time of day, and the atmosphere of the room all influence it. In a digital archive, can a tale still have life? Balance may hold the answer. Modernity does not have to mean that oral tradition must disappear. It can mix in with it. Listening to podcasts can help you remember things. Stories told live can bring people from all around the world together. The goal is more important than the format, because as long as people speak and others listen, oral tradition survives, not as a relic, but as a living bridge between past and future. And its next chapter is being written with voice, not ink, or tucked deep within Egypt's western desert, beyond dunes that roll like waves and sun-bleached rocks that shimmer under a brutal sun, lies the Siwa oasis, a place of improbable life and ancient mystery. Siwa is a mirage become true, surrounded by dry desolation on all sides, where there should be no olive trees, date palm orchards, or cool freshwater springs. However, neither its beauty nor its seclusion are its real claims to fame. It's the voice of God that used to reverberate from its dunes. The temple of the Oracle of Amun was a holy place devoted to one of Egypt's most revered deities, located at an isolated outpost close to the Egyptian and Libyan borders. Amun was more than just a Nile deity. He merged with the solar deity Ra to create Amun-Ra, the monarch of the gods, and his influence spread throughout civilizations. However, Siwa's oracle was more than a place of worship. It served as a spiritual lighthouse where people went to ask questions about fate and get answers, rather than to worship mindlessly. At Siwa, the temple of Amun was small in comparison to the massive temples of Thebes or Karnak. Silence and secrecy were its greatest assets. It was constructed of limestone and mud brick and had withstood ages of heat and wind. The temple overlooked the wide expanse of the desert and was tucked away among the sandstone cliffs of the town. It had the feel of a divine whisper rather than a monument, powerful, private, and hidden. It was believed that the oracle at Siwa provided answers from Amun himself by speaking via the high priest during ceremonial ceremonies or trances. Questions of identity, succession, and battle were raised by those who were permitted to approach the shrine. Pharaohs and conquerors, as well as ordinary people, traveled across the scorching sands in search of a glimpse of their future. Siwa was unique for reasons other than its remoteness. It was its autonomy. Despite being officially a part of Egypt, the oasis had its own rhythm. The Berber dialect was used by its residents. Its clerics were more than just state agents. They fiercely protected the oracle on their own. The actual desert served both a physical and mental barrier. It was thought that hearing the oracle's voice was a sign of assurance from the gods, something that few people ever experienced. But getting to Siwa was a test of resolve. Unlike previous oracles, the Amun oracle at Siwa was unique. It did not reside in the opulent temples of the Nile Valley or the busy Egyptian towns. There was only the eerie wind and dunes all around it, and everything was silent. It gained power and mystery from its seclusion. People thought that the gods could only be heard in such silence. The oracle's ceremonies were shrouded in mystery. As Amun's spokesperson, the high priest would withdraw into the inner sanctum, which was only ever open to a chosen few. He would go into a trance-like state there, in a room surrounded by tall stone walls and laden with incense, his speech supposedly bearing the weight of divine wisdom. They whispered their questions. Once given, the answers were accepted without question. The responses themselves were frequently meaningless and veiled in obscurity. The Siwa oracle, like the Greek oracle at Delphi, hardly ever used direct language. Its strength was in suggestion, in providing guidance without prescribing outcomes. But unlike Delphi, the Siwan oracle was also deeply intertwined with Egyptian religious cosmology. It wasn't merely a seer, it was a channel of a god who was also king. In order to hear the oracles speak, pilgrims braved the harsh trek over the western desert from all over North Africa and beyond. In search of heavenly guidance on the most challenging decisions of their life, merchants, generals, tribal leaders, and even kings arrived bearing offerings, oil, incense, and gold. Some came with questions that may decide a nation's fate, while others came for personal advice. The enchantment was enhanced by the oasis itself. The desert became silent and incredibly dark at night, with stars filling the sky. Voices could nearly be heard in the wind through the date palm. Following their visit, visitors would claim having visions, having dreams, or experiencing spontaneous epiphanies. The experience made a lasting impression, whether by suggestion or ritual. But those who came weren't only religious seekers. Politicians recognized the oracle's importance. To be granted its approval was to assert legitimacy, not only among Mediterranean residents, but also internationally. Siwa's prophecies had the power to establish an empire, legitimize a war, or install a monarch. Soon, a man would put that same power to the test by asking a question that no mortal had yet ventured to ask. Was he just a king or a god? With a crown on his head and a question in his heart, a young conqueror rode into the Egyptian desert in 331 BCE. Alexander of Macedon, popularly referred to as Alexander the Great, was his name. He was crowned pharaoh by this time, having previously vanquished the Persian Empire in Egypt. Titles, however, were insufficient. Alexander came to Siwa in search of heavenly confirmation, not from humans, but from the gods. The trip was dangerous. There was no clear map showing the route from Memphis to Siwa. It meandered through shifting dunes, salt flats, and arid desert. According to Greek historians, only divine signs kept Alexander and his convoy from going awry. Perhaps heavenly serpents slithering across the sand, or ravens directing their path. Others said that rainstorms were in charge of them, unusual occurrences in such arid territory. Despite their embellishment, these stories capture the mythological spirit of the entire journey. What made Alexander take such a big chance to go to the temple? His goal to become more than human, not only to govern the known world, is the answer. Alexander, like his predecessors, sought divine legitimacy. His earthy voice murmured from the temple of Siwan, and he believed, or wanted others to believe, that he was not just the son of Philip of Macedon, but the son of Zeus Ammon, the supreme god of the Greek and Egyptian pantheons. Alexander received a warm reception upon his arrival at the oasis. The priests welcomed him in the inner sanctum of the temple, a unique honor, perhaps fully aware of his influence and political clout. It's still unclear what happened at that meeting. There is no thorough account. However, Alexander came out a different person. He thereafter became notoriously evasive when asked what the oracle had revealed to him. According to other accounts, the oracle referred to him as Zeus's son. Others claim that Alexander was given a prophecy of divine favor and victory. Regardless, Alexander's actions altered. He presented himself more and more as a semi-divine being who demanded allegiance as a god in human form, rather than merely as a monarch. He had received more than a simple response from the desert. It had given him myth, and myth, once asserted, had the power to transform empires, move armies, and construct cities. Alexander never turned back after hearing the temple's voice. In terms of both geography and spirituality, the Temple of the Oracle at Siwa was situated at the intersection of several cultures. One of Egypt's most potent gods for a very long time was Amun. However, Zeus Ammon, a combination of two supreme gods, Greek and Egyptian, came together in the fiery Siwa desert, and Amun changed in the hearts of the people as Greek influence extended into Egypt. This combination was not merely symbolic. It was an example of a larger phenomenon known as syncretism, which is the mingling of rituals, imagery, and beliefs that happens when empires collide. Zeus, the bearded, thunder-wielding, all-powerful king of the gods, was revered by the Greeks. For the Egyptians, Amun was the breath that gave creation its existence. He was invisible, enigmatic, and hidden. Ram's horns, which stand for strength, virility, and the presence of God, were frequently used to represent him. Amun was given the name Zeus Ammon by the Greeks, who recognized him as a familiar authority. This dual identity had tremendous significance at Siwa. Despite their Egyptian origins and training in archaic rituals, the priests there were well known across the Hellenistic world. Alexander the Great and other Greek visitors saw Zeus Ammon's oracle as a bridge between civilizations as well as a voice from God. Alexander could rule over both Greeks and Egyptians with a single divine ancestry if he were to be proclaimed the son of Zeus Ammon. He was followed by the images. Alexander was depicted wearing ram's horns on coins struck during his rule, a clear allusion to Zeus Ammon and his divine ancestry. This was a political statement rather than a decorative flourish. Not only did the gods support Alexander, but they were part of him. This assertion aided in the unification of a huge empire where religion served as a weapon of state just as much as the sword or the law. The cult of Zeus Ammon extended outside of Siwa. In North Africa, Greece, and even certain regions of Asia, temples were constructed or renamed in his honor. The mystique of a god who was both familiar and alien, Greek and Egyptian, drew pilgrims to continue their journey to Siwa. The temple had evolved from a shrine to a cosmic intersection of destinies, gods, and civilizations. One may hear the voice of a globe undergoing change rather than just one culture in the echo of its oracle. And Zeus Ammon was king in that metamorphosis. In contrast to the expansive avenues of Karnak or the tall pylons of Luxor, the Temple of the Oracle at Siwa was little in size but colossal in significance. Constructed into the Akurmi Hills limestone cliffs, the building appeared to have grown out of the rock itself, blending in perfectly with the surrounding desert. However, this was a decision rather than a fault of grandeur. The temple's power comes from its secret rather than its size. Pilgrims would ascend toward a sanctuary built into the hill as they approached the temple, passing through tight gates and tortuous routes. The structure consisted of a modest hall, a courtyard, and the Holy of Holies, the inner room believed to house the oracle's voice. Only the high priest and a few chosen people, like Alexander, were allowed in this last area. Its sacredness was hidden by its simplicity. There was only silence and the invisible presence of a god, no imposing sculptures or golden shrines. The design of the temple was intended to be both humbling and confusing. Visitors were compelled to slow down, bow their heads, and move with caution and reverence due to the narrow hallways and acute angles. The temple provided shelter and tranquility in the desert, where openness and emptiness reigned. The sanctuary was hardly illuminated. The air would have been thick with incense, whispers become otherworldly due to echoes. The drama of the oracle's pronouncements may have been enhanced by roof apertures or vents that allowed the priest's voice to be carried into adjacent rooms, according to scholars. When a god spoke from the shadows, people would be in awe of what they heard rather than what they saw. The architecture served as ritualistic theatre in addition to being practical. Sacred gardens nourished by natural springs, ritual pools, priests' quarters, and other buildings surrounded the temple. It was believed that the oasis itself was touched by supernatural hands, because Siwa was endowed with water despite being in a barren region. The limitless dunes that could be seen from this holy hill served as a reminder of the temple's significance and remoteness. This was a location for pilgrims, prophets, and monarchs, not for throngs. A place meant to evoke the soul rather than the eyes, and the future could be whispered from stone in that silent, enclosed room. The temple of the oracle at Siwa started to wane, not in myth, but in voice, as the centuries went by and empires changed. Once stirring the arid winds, the holy breath became motionless. The oracle's prominence had started to decline by the time the Roman Empire established itself in Egypt. A remnant of a dying world, it had once been a celestial meeting point of monarchs and gods. The oracle was never silent for a single second. It unraveled gradually. The political unity that had given the temple its significance disintegrated after Alexander's death in 323 BCE, when his generals engaged in a brutal struggle for his empire. Even while Zeus Ammon was still revered in name, the allure of the Siwa trip had diminished. As philosophy and science started to supplant oracular faith, power moved back to the Nile Valley and to towns like Alexandria. Rome's ascent brought with it new objectives, new laws, and new gods. Egyptian cults received lip service from Roman emperors, but the dark ambiguity of oracles was not given much space in the centralized bureaucratic religion of the empire. Shrines like Siwa's were no longer consulted on affairs of state, but were instead viewed as charming relics of a fabled past. Christianity followed. It harshly exposed the ancient pagan practices as it swept over Egypt in the early centuries of the Common Era. Temples to the ancient gods were being closed or converted by the 4th century under the Christianized Roman Empire. Oracles were criticized for being dishonest or evil. And the voice of Ammon at Siwa, which was already a whisper, was silenced in this massive religious upheaval. The temple itself deteriorated, its stones worn by sandstorms and the passage of time. Priests disappeared. The rituals came to an end. Buried beneath the sands of history, the god who once talked to Alexander and led monarchs now stood silent. Still, tourists who were interested in its legacy discovered nothing but ruins and quiet. Nevertheless, the tale persisted. Scholars and dreamers whispered about Siwa, a place that became legendary. The temple had gained something even though it had lost its oracle. Mysterious. The temple became immortal in quiet, not in voice but in stone, not in prophecy but in remembrance. The temple of the oracle at Siwa was concealed from the outside world for generations, buried not beneath debris but behind oblivion. People continued to live in the oasis in peaceful continuation. However, because of the constant desert winds, the once holy shrine was no longer a destination for pilgrims. Though still passed down among the people, its legends had vanished from the collective consciousness. This started to alter in the 18th and 19th centuries, when European researchers and explorers focused on the Western Desert after becoming enthralled with ancient Egypt. Reaching Siwa was challenging because of its remote location, which was shielded by hostile tribes and rugged terrain. However, William George Brown, an Englishman, made the first known European expedition in 1792. Others followed, lured by stories of Alexander the Great's visit to a lost oracle. Historians and archaeologists started seriously examining the ruins around the beginning of the 20th century. It was determined that the Temple of Amun was most likely located on the Akermi hill complex. Despite its modest size, the structure was in line with old literature descriptions. Thick defensive walls, a central chamber, and a view of the surrounding oasis. Despite its lack of grandeur, the temple was situated precisely where history said it would be. There were few and careful excavations. Despite degradation, there was still some stonework and inscriptions at the site. Despite its fragmentation, the architecture was very expressive. Rooms oriented in relation to the stars, a stone altar, and remnants of columns. Every hint indicated that kings and gods had once listened to this windswept wreck. The mythology of Siwa was more fascinating than archaeology. Generations of people were captivated by the notion that Alexander had stood here by himself in a desert refuge, hearing words that would alter entire empires. Travelers, poets, and historians all romanticized the trip, fusing mythology and reality into an enduring story. People still travel to Siwa today to experience the echo of its quiet rather than to speak with an oracle. The temple is still standing despite its wear. The air surrounding it still hums with an old, unsolved energy, despite the sun-bleached stones and disintegrating walls. Voices are not necessary for ruins to speak. They communicate through mystery and presence. What the world once forgot is remembered by the stones of Siwa. The oasis of Siwa is nevertheless alive with culture, memory, and life, even though the temple no longer carries the word of the gods. Siwa is far from being a forgotten outpost. Rather, it is a thriving, dynamic village whose residents are stewards of a millennium-old legacy. Despite the oracle's silence, the customs it once sparked continue to influence the town's language, customs, and rhythms. A monument to the oasis' old origins, Siwans speak a distinctive Berber dialect called Siwi, which is exclusive to Egypt. The importance of oral storytelling has not changed since the oracle's day. Myths, family histories, and regional folklore are passed down by elders, subtly fusing pre-Islamic traditions with Islamic beliefs. Many Siwans still recite stories about Alexander's visit from memory rather than from books. Echoes of the past are also preserved in Siwa's architecture. The village is lined with traditional mud brick structures that provide relief from the intense heat of the desert, and the abandoned stronghold of Shali, which was constructed out of clay and salt, still looms over the oasis like a relic from another era. These buildings' designs exhibit a form-function consistency that has withstood alteration for centuries. The holy landscape of Siwa is still potent. Pools and springs nearby are still revered. The well-known queen herself is said to have utilized Cleopatra's pool, a natural spring that is now a favorite among residents and tourists. Fertility, harvest, and healing rituals are still practiced today. Many of them are mixed with Islamic prayers but have their roots in earlier customs. Some aspects of Siwa's spiritual heritage are preserved even in marriage festivals, such as the yearly event held at Gebel Dakro. Similar to the old meetings that used to take place in the temple, where people sought advice not just for battle and monarchy, but also for life itself, families congregate, songs reverberate, and matches are forged. Siwa has evolved into a peaceful pilgrimage site of a different kind in the present era, one that is made for peace rather than prophecy. Visitors come here to stroll among the palm groves, take in the quiet of the desert, and think back to a period when the gods spoke from stone in order to escape the cacophony of civilization. Siwa serves as a reminder that history exists in people, customs, and memories rather than just in books or underground, and the oracle continues to whisper through them, not with thunder. Even if the Siwa Oracle Temple is no longer in its entirety, its legacy lives on in myth, memory, and the thoughts of people who look for significance outside of the written word. Its voice soothed pilgrims and led kings for generations. Its aura is only heightened by its quiet today. There were few locations in antiquity with such a deep sense of sacred ambiguity, where silence might feel divine and questions weighed more than answers. Siwa's oracle endures in the stories we tell, not in rites that have been resurrected. One of the most interesting turning points in history is still Alexander the Great's visit. Surrounded by sand, a mortal man tries to prove that he is more than human. The result was the same whether the oracle actually proclaimed him a god or only led him to believe such. It shaped destiny. This combination of myth and history is what gives Siwa its timeless appeal. It poses ageless queries to us. Is it possible for men to become gods? Is it possible to reveal fate? Does the voice of truth always ever speak in riddles, or does it ever speak clearly? Most importantly, do we still keep an ear out for those whispers? The ruins are visited by contemporary searchers seeking presence, clarity, and calm rather than empire or conquest. The temple is deteriorating but captivating, while the landscape is still wide and immobile. Now interested travelers are warmed by the same sun that burnt Alexander's caravan. The ruined walls are still shrouded in the same hush that formerly encircled the Holy of Holies. Siwa encourages introspection because it has always honored the request, not because it provides answers. Like all ancient voices, the oracle never claimed to be able to predict the future. It has to do with possibilities, affirmation, and direction. The trek over the sands was a ceremony of metamorphosis rather than merely a physical test. Along the road, you changed into someone else. You didn't just get to the temple. Perhaps the oracle still has something to offer us now as we confront our own deserts of identity, meaning, and purpose. It was a silent suggestion in the mind rather than a loud shout from the past. Really, who are you and what are you turning into? The voice is gone, the temple is dust. However, the question still stands, and maybe that was the real prophecy all along.